Okay, so let's start. So in the last lecture, we looked at mean field theory. So we'll just quickly do a recap of that. So the idea of the mean field theory is to forget about the details of the system and try to say that every individual dynamical degree of freedom experiences an overall averaged effect of all other dynamical systems, besides, of course, if there are any external stimuli, okay, like external magnetic field or uh, if you apply additional temperature, in the sense you connect it to the heat bath and stuff like that. Leaving that aside, you treat the internal degrees of freedom of the system to behave in such a way that every individual degree of freedom gets an averaged kind of effect of all other degrees of freedom, and then you just try to study this system in this approximation. So of course it's quite a crude approximation. In some sense, you assume that the effective field generated by all uh, other degrees of freedom is going to be kind of constant, uh, no matter which degree of freedom you choose to concentrate on. You will see roughly the same field generated by all other degrees of freedom. Okay, so in the mean field theory, you would expect the the so-called mean field to take constant value all over the sample. Okay, so that is how one starts off. Nevertheless, it has a interesting result, in the sense, in our spin system, we assign some averaged value for the spins, and that average value of the spin contributed to uh, mag effective magnetic field, and that external magnetic field plus this effective magnetic field was called HI at every lattice site I. We then found that the magnetization is still the same tan hyperbolic function. Only difference is that it's a tan hyperbolic function not only of just H, but H plus the uh, interaction term J, which was a binary interaction between nearest neighbor spins. But this small change was quite crucial in the sense that if you set the external magnetic field to 0, you get an equation M is equal to tan hyperbolic 2 beta dmj for a d-dimensional hypercubic lattice. And of course, this equation has to be solved self-consistently because M appears on both sides. So what we did was we solved it using graphical method. Uh, we basically plotted this we first defined Tc to be 2dj upon the Boltzmann constant, and then we plotted this function, the tan hyperbolic function versus the linear function, and checked at what point it would cross. And we found that when T was greater than Tc, there was only crossing at m equals 0, which means there is no magnetization. But when T was less than Tc, it had 3 crossings, and of which m equals 0 was a point which was unstable, whereas m not equal to 0 were stable points. Okay, although we did not do the analysis in this fashion, but as we'll go ahead, we'll see why m equals 0 is unstable and m not equal to 0 is a stable point. Okay, but that is how graphical depiction was. And then we claimed that if you are at temperatures higher than Tc, then there is no spontaneous magnetization, but T less than Tc, you have spontaneous magnetization. We then expanded the right-hand side function by kind of using tan hyperbolic function identity, and then use the fact that that when the external magnetic field is small, then for arbitrary T, the magnetization also would be small. Okay, at least in the neighborhood of Tc, this statement is true whether you are above Tc or below Tc. Okay, and so therefore you expand this function and you get an expression like this. We use this expression to derive critical exponents. So first critical exponent that we derived was what was called beta, And the beta critical exponent was determined by finding out how the magnetization depends on temperature as T approaches Tc. And we found that M goes as Tc minus T to the beta, and that beta turns out to be half within the mean field approximation. Okay, so of course we are looking at this temperature reaching Tc from below. So we are in the regime in which there is spontaneous magnetization. Okay, so we kind of plotted it. What we really know is only the neighborhood of Tc. We really don't know how the function here behaves, but we know that as the temperature goes to 0, the magnetization per site would have value either +1 or -1, because that is the value that the spin is allowed to take. Okay, so therefore we know that asymptotically it has to reach ±1 as temperature goes to 0, and at Tc it has to have a kind of parabolic behavior. One can of course write down a microscopic theory to get this whole function correct, but we will not do it right now. Okay, the next critical exponent we found was delta, and that was the dependence of magnetization on the external magnetic field. Maybe I should just split the screen. Okay, so this is the equation that we need. So we determined dependence of magnetization on external magnetic field at T is equal to Tc. So if you do that, then at T equals Tc, the linear term vanishes and you have a cubic term which is related to H. You can check that at T equals Tc, this term doesn't vanish. Okay, so therefore you find that H is proportional to M cube, and therefore delta is 3. Okay, that is the thing that we found. The next critical exponent that we found was the magnetic susceptibility. That is a measure of how the magnetization responds to change in external magnetic field. You change the external magnetic field a little. If the magnetization changes a lot, the system is highly susceptible. So that is what one does. So to do that, you basically differentiate this equation and write down the equation like this, and then you can read off chi from this equation in the limit when m goes to 0. Okay, so that is what you will get when t is greater than tc. Yes, is there a question?
Sir,
yes.
When we defined average magnetization,
Yeah.
Do we, so not in the average magnetization, when we define chi,
Yes.
do we take the limit h tends to 0?
Yes. We want to ask what happens when you change the magnetic field a little.
Because otherwise,
yeah, otherwise the external magnetic field itself would kind of force the magnetization to be whatever value it wants, right?
Yeah.
So this is done when you're looking at magnetization and of the system on its own, and then you turn on a small external perturbation, and for that external perturbation, if you set it to 0, what happens to the system? Okay, so
Okay.
So in other words, you think of m as a function of h, and then you expand m and in terms of powers of h, and then you keep a term which is linear in h. Okay, that is chi. Okay.
Okay.
Fine. So here you basically set m is equal to 0 if you are working in the system. Working when the system is above Tc, with the temperature is above Tc, and in that case you can find that this expression will tell you chi goes as 1 over T minus Tc. On the other hand, if you are working at temperature below Tc, then you could kind of substitute how m behaves as a function of T and rewrite this expression. We define gamma as a critical exponent, and we find gamma in the mean field case to be 1. Okay, and for T less than Tc, if you substitute m like that, Oh, I did not correct this. I should have corrected this one. Uh, okay, this should be half. Okay, so you find that uh, in the mean field approximation, chi still goes as t minus tc. Okay, so you get a gamma prime, which is also 1. Then we also computed specific heat exponents, and the specific heat exponents had the following behavior in terms of critical exponents in the neighborhood of t equals tc. It goes as t minus tc to the minus alpha or tc minus t to the minus alpha prime, whether you approach tc from above or from below. And of course, to determine specific heat, you basically kind of compute the magnetic energy stored in the system, and then you use that to try to determine how the uh, magnetic energy of the system depends on temperature. Okay, so that is how we computed in the absence of external stimulus, because otherwise external stimulus itself could kind of generate some magnetic energy in the system. Okay, fine. So given that there is no spontaneous magnetization above Tc, E is of course 0 there, but below Tc you have some contribution, and but in both cases you will find that the uh, specific heat goes as constant. It would just go as different constants. So in that sense, it shows discontinuity across T equals Tc, as against, say, susceptibility, which would show divergence as T goes to Tc. Okay, fine. So we find alpha and alpha prime within mean field theory to be 0. Okay, they are just constant. So what we have found is that there exists a bunch of critical exponents which describe the behavior of the system in the neighborhood of critical temperature T equals Tc. Okay, these critical exponents don't have much value if you are quite far from critical temperature, because the behavior of the system is totally different there. The disturbances generated in the system would die out very fast, as I had argued earlier, that if you kind of disturb but disturb one particular lattice site, and if you are reasonably far from the critical point, then a few lattice site or few tens of lattice site would kind of feel the disturbance, but after that the effect would die out. But if you are in the neighborhood of a critical point, then you disturb one spin or one lattice site, whatever is the degree of freedom sitting there, doesn't have to be spin. Then that effect may propagate a large distance, in fact, could even propagate over the entire size of the system. Okay, and as you could see that many of these critical exponents were falling off as a function of temperature or say external stimuli in the power law behavior. These systems, of course, would therefore have long range kind of correlations. Okay, now of course, as I said, that if you do mean field approximation, then everything seems to be spatially independent, and therefore whatever we have computed so far does not seem to have any explicit space dependence in any of these results. Okay, although we will see effects of those kind. Okay, so what we have seen so far is alpha alpha prime, beta, gamma gamma prime, delta. In addition, there are two other critical exponents which we will see soon, and this forms in some sense a complete set of critical exponents for systems of this kind, in systems which are in the neighborhood of critical point. Okay, so so fine. So the name comes because we are near the critical point. Okay, so so what we'll do now is to define what is called an order parameter. But before that, any questions about critical exponents? Okay, so maybe then we can go ahead with the discussion of the order parameter. So in our model, we have, which is a spin system, which made a transition from paramagnetic phase to ferromagnetic phase as you decrease the temperature. Okay. In the paramagnetic phase, the system was such that the spins chose to align in any direction they wanted in the absence of external magnetic field. But because it is paramagnetic, when you apply external magnetic field, the spins prefer to align in the direction of the external magnetic field. That is how a paramagnetic state is. Okay. But in general, the system has sufficient energy to overcome any nearest neighbor interaction. We should try to force spins to point either in the same direction or in the opposite direction. Okay. So in that sense, paramagnetic phase has a lot of energy available. Okay. However, um, uh, because the spin could point in arbitrary directions, effective magnetization in the paramagnetic state is zero. Okay, as long as the external magnetic field is zero. Of course, if you apply external magnetic field, then spins would choose to point in the direction of the external magnetic field, and therefore there is an effective magnetization in the system. But if you are at temperature larger than Tc, then you turn off the external magnetic field and the spins would start behaving any which way they want. And therefore, if you wait long enough, the system would again have zero net magnetization. Okay. Compare that with the state which is below the critical temperature, namely the ferromagnetic state. That is the one which we are looking at. In this case, there is non-zero net magnetization. And this non-zero net magnetization has nothing to do with external magnetic field. Now, of course, you may want to have external magnetic field turned on while the system is undergoing the transition, because if you do that, then the system may have larger number of spins aligned in one particular direction, and therefore you would have some effective magnetization. If not, then it is possible that the system would consist of large number of domains which are smaller in size compared to the system size, and their vector addition would turn out to be essentially zero, and therefore may not lead to any effective magnetization even below T equals Tc. Okay, so if you really want to get ferromagnetic state with spin point preferably pointing in one particular direction, then the best way to do that is to keep small external magnetic field on as the system undergoes a transition from T above Tc to T below Tc. Okay, is that fine? Okay, so here's the usual nomenclature that one uses in the critical systems, particularly in the spin system. The paramagnetic state is called the disordered state, and okay, I'll correct that. And the ferromagnetic state is called the ordered state. Okay, fine. So consistent with this nomenclature, one would define the net magnetization of the system as the order parameter of the system. Okay, so of course, if you are in a disordered state, then you would expect the order parameter not to have any value. Okay, and that is what we have in the paramagnetic state. There is no net magnetization, and therefore M would be zero in the disordered state. On the other hand, ferromagnetic state is ordered state, and that is a state in which you have non-zero magnetization. Okay, so now of course, when one says that the system is in the disordered phase, one doesn't really mean that there is. I mean, there are no domains of spins which would be pointing in one direction or something. That can still happen, even for temperatures T greater than Tc. Okay, it is just that those domains may be very small. Okay, and like if you kind of connect the system to heat bath, those domains may just dissolve also. Okay, but that such a structure does not exist at all is not the statement that one is trying to make. what one is trying to say is that effective magnetization of the system for T greater than Tc would be 0. Okay. As against, compare this with the domains that I talked about within the ferromagnetic system. And while the domains in the paramagnetic state would be small in size, the domains in ferromagnetic system are reasonably large in size. Okay. Although if you are working in thermodynamic limit, or if you are working with very large system, these domains may still be much smaller than the total size of the system. Okay, but size of the ferromagnetic domains are much larger than the size of domains inside, say, paramagnetic state. Okay, fine. So to put it a little differently, the disordered state is the one which has total magnetization 0. That is how we would basically define. Okay. So in some sense, the total number of, if you are looking binary spin system, then total number of up spin and down spins would be equal. And if you have small domains, then the total number of domains pointing in up and down direction also would be an equal number. Okay. Yeah, I seem to be switching between D and F. The place where I should write D, I write F somehow, and the vice versa. Okay, so for T below Tc, what one finds is that the domains are larger and they tend to point in the same direction. And if you have net magnetization, which could be sourced due to small external magnetic field while system is doing the transition, then you may have much fewer spins or much fewer domains which are pointing in the direction opposite to the net magnetization direction. Okay. Now, what we have done so far is basically studied the system we have studied this system only as a spin system. Okay, and we have basically looked for paramagnetic to ferromagnetic transition. Okay, but the concept that we have just introduced called order parameter, okay, this concept is not restricted to only the system that we are looking, only the spin system. It's not that. It is a general concept and can be used for any other system. Okay, so for example, if you are looking at, say, a binary alloy system, okay, so consider, say, something like copper zinc alloy. Okay, so brass is one of the copper zinc alloy with 50-50% of copper and zinc in it. Okay, so this alloy at low temperature has copper atoms surrounded by zinc atoms. That this is a kind of configuration. So you can imagine this setup in the following form: that you have a cubic lattice, and in the cubic lattice, every lattice point is occupied by copper atom. Okay, so that is the usual copper lattice that you would see. Now, when you have 50% zinc doped into the system, or when you have made the alloy, you can't use the word doping really, but when you make an alloy, then zinc goes and occupies some space in between. Okay, so what it does is that it sits at the center of the cube. Okay, that kind of structure is called body center cubic lattice. Okay, so if you look at every cube and if you put zinc at the center of it, then you would find that zinc itself forms a cubic lattice. Okay, and copper sits at the body center of that cubic lattice. Okay, so in that sense, the system is kind of symmetric. Whether you look at copper lattice with zinc sitting at the body center sides, or zinc lattice with copper sitting at the body's center side. Okay, they would be equivalent. To put it, so in other words, what one says is that copper and zinc system inside the brass can be thought of as two different sublattices. Okay, there are two cubic lattices which are kind of pushed into each other in such a way that with respect to one cubic lattice, the other cubic lattice is occupying body center point of every cube. Okay, that is the kind of structure the brass has. Okay. Now, so you can take any point of view. Okay. So I have taken one point of view, but nothing very special about it. So the point of view that I have taken is that I have a cubic lattice. Copper atoms are populating the cubic vertices of the cubic lattice, and zinc atoms are sitting at the body center point. Okay. This is the configuration at low temperatures. Okay, it looks like a perfect body center cubic lattice if you are sufficiently at low temperature. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll define the density variable uh, for this system on one particular sublattice. So look at, say, copper sublattice, okay, or zinc, it doesn't matter. Okay, so suppose you are looking at copper sublattice, then you ask the following question, that I define density to be density of copper minus density of zinc. Okay. So now if you are at temperature T equals 0, where you have a perfect lattice, then on the copper sublattice at this cubic structure, every lattice point is occupied by copper atoms. Okay. And there is no lattice point occupied by zinc atom. Okay. So in that case, rho is equal to rho u, Cu. Okay. Rho copper. Okay. But if you are at finite temperature, then system has some energy available depending upon what is the temperature. That would allow the lattice to vibrate, that would allow atoms to kind of move, and they could dislocate one atom and occupy that point. Okay. So what we want to ask is that if you are at finite temperature, then there may be a small density of zinc atoms occupying the copper sublattice. Okay, so that would give you a rho, which is rho copper minus rho zinc on a copper sublattice. Okay, is it making sense?
So can you repeat why at low temperatures rho is approximately rho Cu?
Okay, so what we are doing is the following, that you look at the lattice in the following way, that you have a cubic copper lattice, okay, and zinc is sitting at the center of the cube. Okay, is it fine?
Yeah.
Okay, so now if you are at 0 temperature, then the lattice is in the perfect state. Okay, barring quantum fluctuation, the system doesn't have any thermal fluctuation. There is no energy available for copper, zinc to move around. Okay, so in that case, if you look at the copper sublattice, that means the vertices of the cube, then you would find that vertices of cube would be completely populated by copper. Okay, and all zinc atoms are sitting at the center of the cubes. Okay, now I want to define rho with respect to what happens to the cubic lattice. Okay, not what happens with the center of the cube. Okay, so if you look at the cubic lattice, then at 0 temperature, all of them would be occupied by copper. Okay, and that is why rho will be equal to rho Cu. Okay, if any of those would be occupied by zinc, you would call that as a defect, because it should have been occupied by copper, but zinc is occupying it. Okay, so that is what we would have called defect in the system at 0 temperature. At finite temperature, of course, there is some energy available in the system, and both zinc and copper atoms can move from the so-called uh, lattice point, lattice location, and in fact, lattice itself can vibrate because there is a thermal energy available, and they could trigger kind of lattice vibrations in the system. Okay, so if you try to look at that system, you may find that there may be some fraction of zinc atoms who have dislodged copper and occupying the copper sublattice, and the dislodged copper, of course, is occupying the center of the cube of this defect cubic system. Okay, where some of the lattice points has copper atoms and some other lattice points have zinc atom, and then instead of zinc being at the center of the cube, copper is at the center of the cube. Okay, so if you have a setup like that, then rho is not equal to rho Cu, but rho is equal to rho Cu minus whatever is the fraction of zinc occupying the copper lattice. At zero temperature, you don't have that much energy available. Of course, I am starting with the assumption that brass is a good crystal. Okay, I'm not assuming. Of course, itself could have defects, but for purely theoretical purposes, we are assuming that to be a good lattice, and a good lattice would have this structure. Okay, but even the good lattice at finite temperature would have fluctuations, dislocations, and so on, that would allow the road to change. Okay, so that is why at low temperatures, the copper sublattice would have density same as the density of copper. Okay, whereas as you start kind of changing the temperature, as you start heating up the system, then you will find that copper and zinc would kind of start moving, and the rate of expansion of zinc sublattice is different from the rate of expansion of copper sublattice, and as a result, the system phase separates. Okay, and in that case, you find that zinc, instead of sitting at the body center, at times actually dislodges copper, and effective density rho is starts becoming smaller and smaller, and at some point becomes zero. Okay, so if the temperature is sufficiently high, then rho would just be zero. Okay, but at lower temperatures, the sublattice density would be non-zero. So therefore, for a binary alloy system, we would define this sublattice density to be the order parameter of the system. Okay, and this order parameter is non-zero below a particular temperature and zero above. Okay, so we would say that the system would go into a disordered state if the temperature is higher than a particular value. Okay. Now we could try to describe the copper zinc alloy system by writing down a Hamiltonian, and we could try to study the properties of this system as you change the temperature. You can look at various thermodynamic quantities pertaining to alloy like this. Okay, so one could kind of go ahead and write down partition function and stuff like that. But it turns out that the critical behavior of this binary alloy uh, turns out to be very similar to the structure of the Ising model. In fact, some of the critical exponents are identical. So one says that a binary alloy system is in the same class as the Ising model. Okay, so therefore you do not really need to study copper zinc alloy system separately. Of course, it is not to say that, like, this is not a purely kind of speculation or something. People have studied binary alloy system on their own, okay, without worrying about what Ising model is dictating us, and studied their critical behavior and found that the critical exponents agree with the Ising model critical exponents. Okay, so in that sense, they identify these kind of models also belonging to the what are called Ising universality class. Okay, so as I defined universality class as a set of models whose behavior in the neighborhood of critical point agrees with each other. Okay, so that is what we call a universality class. Okay, this is almost like the way one would define equivalence classes. Okay, fine. So let's get back to the description of the Ising model. Uh, so as I said that, like, if you are studying mean field approximation, then every spin within the spin model, say, every spin in the system would see this roughly the same mean field. Okay, and therefore you would expect the mean field to be essentially constant over the entire system. Okay, so if you want to study spatial correlation, okay, then it seems like an odd thing to try within the mean field approximation. Okay, but nevertheless, there are certain things that you need to compute which would require spatial correlations. For example, suppose you turn on, well, you don't have to turn on anything, but suppose you kind of look at one particular lattice site, and if you kind of disturb the spin at that lattice site, okay, so let's call that lattice site I, and you kind of disturb the spin Si at that lattice site. Now what you want to do is, you are close to critical temperature. You want to ask a question: how is this effect felt by spin at lattice J, lattice point J? Okay. Now J could be a nearest neighbor. J could be kind of 10 lattice sites away. J could be 10,000 lattice sites away. Okay. We would like to know how far does this disturbance go. Okay. Now, to determine this, you clearly need to ask what is the spatial dependence of the correlations between what happens to the spin S at site I and how it affects the spin S at site J. Okay. Now, given that the mean field has no chance of kind of giving you any spatial correlation, it kind of seems like, we would be asking a wrong question at this place. Okay. But one way to do this is to actually turn on external field which is inhomogeneous. Okay. So if you have inhomogeneous external field, then that inhomogeneous external field could generate this effect which has some kind of space dependence. Okay. Fine. So as I said, that we wanted to study the 2-point function, and we would like to kind of relate that to the magnetic susceptibility. Okay. Just a second. Okay. So the idea is to actually compute the 2-point function, and this 2-point function is actually related to magnetic susceptibility, and we will see how these two relations come about. Okay, so the 2-point function is exactly what I was describing a few minutes ago. That is that if you disturb the spin at lattice I, that is site I, you want to know whether the spin at lattice site J sees the effect or not. Okay, so that is the thing that we want to compute. Okay, now of course, if you try to compute this, then this contains two pieces. One is a piece which is what is called the connected piece, and other is a disconnected piece. Okay, disconnected piece means it just, spin at site I may have some average value, spin at site J may have average value, and that could also contribute to this expectation value. Okay, so what we want to do is, we don't want to collect that information. We want to collect information which is a connected information. Okay, so therefore we subtract this piece. Okay, to put it a little differently, if there are non-vanishing expectation values of these quantities, though that information is irrelevant for us, the relevant information is that if you disturb one spin, how is the effect felt by the second spin? Okay, so this has to have some connection between these two spins, and that connected 2-point function is the information that we really want to collect. Okay, so that is how this quantity comes about. Okay, so let's write down the partition function of the system. This is the usual structure. Remember, Hamiltonian was minus j si hj plus minus j si hj minus h si. Okay, so therefore there is no minus sign when you write down the e to the minus beta h. Okay, good. So what we want to compute while doing this is to compute these quantities first. Okay, they are the disconnected pieces, and if you want to compute average value of Si, okay, what you could do is compute the average value of Si over the entire system by just differentiating the partition function by h. Okay, if you differentiate that, you can just pull this quantity down. Okay, so that's how you get it. Okay, of course it will pull the beta down, So that you need to compensate for. So you write down 1 over beta times 1 over q, so that you don't have the q factor contributing this thing. It gives you a correct normalization of the system, del q by del h. Okay. So one way to do that is actually write down the free energy, which is log of q, and differentiate free energy with respect to h. Okay. On the other hand, if you want to compute the 2-point expectation value, then you basically need to just differentiate that with respect to h twice. Okay. Fine. Now let us recall what was the definition of magnetic susceptibility. Remember, you see this as a second derivative of q sitting around here. Okay. So the magnetic susceptibility is a measure of sensitivity of magnetization. This is something we have already said several times. Okay. So this quantity is del m by del h. But remember, m itself was derived from the free energy. Okay, so therefore you get a quantity which is something like this: 1 over n beta times second derivative with respect to h of log q. Okay, so you can just carry out this computation. You get 1 over n beta times this quantity, with both the derivatives would act on q, would give you second derivative with respect to h of q times 1 over q. And the other possibility is that one of the h's actually act on the q in the denominator, and that gives you 1 over q squared times del q by del h squared. Okay. Now, looking at the expressions that we have written down here, 1 over q del q by del h is averages, and 1 over q del squared q by del h square is 2-point function. Okay. So this expression you can write down as expectation value of SI is j minus square of expectation value of SI. Okay. But this quantity is precisely the quantity that we had defined as the 2-point function. Okay. This was our 2-point function. Okay. But what we actually have is not this 2-point function, but this quantity is summed over all lattice sites. Okay. So let's go down and check that what you actually get is sum over ij of SISJ minus summation over I SI whole squared. So what you really are getting here is beta over n times sum over ij g of xi minus xj. Okay, so you're summing over all lattice sites in this particular case. So if you kind of take a continuum limit of this system, then there is a lattice, what is it called? Unit lattice distance, which is A, and since it's a cubic lattice is what we are looking at, it would be A to the D would be the factor, and then you integrate this G over a D-dimensional space. Okay, fine. So what we find is that the susceptibility is related to integral of the 2-point function, connected 2-point function of the system. Okay, so that is the relation. Okay. Fine. So any questions here? Okay. So yeah. So this basically shows us that the 2-point function of the system that we are looking at is related to the susceptibility, but we have already seen that the susceptibility in the neighborhood of critical point. Okay, I will not go back. I'll probably split the screen again. So we have seen that the susceptibility in the neighborhood of critical point actually shows this kind of divergence. Okay. So there is some kind of divergence that you see in the description of susceptibility, in the neighborhood of critical point. Okay. On the other hand, g of x, as we will see at some point, we have not computed it right now, but when we write down more kind of more microscopic model, we will be able to derive these quantities explicitly. Although even within lattice model, one should be able to compute this, but I think I'll postpone it till I write down an effective field theory description of the system. But what you find is that, like, if the distances are larger compared to this parameter c, okay, then the 2-point function goes like this. It is exponential of minus mod x by z divided by mod x to the d minus 2 by 2 times c to the d minus 3 by 2. Okay, this is the kind of behavior the system seems to show. Okay, fine. So one important aspect of this is that okay, so maybe I should define this, that this parameter c is actually called the correlation length of the system. So if you look at two spins, okay, what is the distance over which these two spins could talk is determined by this parameter c. Okay, fine. So if you look at this function, then you will find that this function has, of course, some power law fall off sitting around here, but its main fall is determined by this exponential function. Okay, and c is a distance or is a number which tells you that the strength of this correlation falls by factor e at distance mod x is equal to c. Okay, because when this is equal to c, then e to the minus 1 implies that this quantity has fallen by factor 1 over e. Okay, of course, there is an additional fall off coming from this mod x to the d minus 2 by 2 factor also, but typically these fall offs are determined by how this exponential function behaves, because as the system kind of goes, as the distances grow beyond c, you'll find that it is the exponential function which should determine the behavior of the correlation function rather than these power laws. Okay, so c is a scale beyond which the correlation has fallen by a factor of e. Okay, so you would say that the typical size of the correlations is of the size of c. Okay.
So
Yes.
we
Yes.
have not particularly discussed, right, how to calculate g of x.
No, that's what I said right right here, that we have not computed g. Sorry, right there, in fact, that we'll see later this computation. So what we'll do is that we'll write down a field theoretic model in which this computation will be easy to do. Okay, this, as I said, this computation can be done even within the lattice approximation, but it would be easier if one gets the better pictures through Landau theory. I mean, Landau theory has makes all these things much more transparent.
Okay.
So right now you just have to take my word that this is how it is going to go, and we will kind of see how this function actually comes about. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. So but we have a problem here. The problem is that chi in the neighborhood of Tc shows divergence. It goes as t minus Tc to the minus 1, whereas g is defined by objects like this. Okay, and these set of functions, exponential, falls off very fast. Okay, so therefore, if you try to integrate g, it is going to give you a finite answer. Okay, because exponential function is going to fall off very rapidly. So contribution from large x's are exponentially small, and at small x's you have this factor sitting around x to the d minus 2 by 2, but you are doing the integral over d dimension, so there is a x to the d minus 1 in the numerator. Okay, so therefore possible divergence that this factor could have created also gets killed because you are doing a d-dimensional integral. Okay, so therefore area under the curve for G, or whatever area under the function for G in d dimension, is just finite. Okay, so how are we going to ever make sense of this object, that this equation, that this quantity diverges, this quantity is finite, and still everything kind of seem to have an equality sign? Okay, well, this can happen only under the following circumstances. Okay, if, yeah, so this is what I was just saying. Yeah, so this may seem like a contradiction, but we will see that the system has to show some divergent behavior in the 2-point correlation function, and this divergent behavior will show up only when C goes to infinity. So as the temperature approaches Tc, if C goes to infinity, then you see what happens here, that when C goes to infinity, you have e to the minus this quantity going to kind of 0. Okay, so this entire factor basically just becomes 1. Okay, once you have gotten rid of exponent, then your G is actually following as power law. Okay, and the C is kind of sitting around here only in the denominator. Okay, and not in the exponent. Okay, in that case, of course, the area under the curve is completely determined by how this function behaves. Okay, so only way you could kind of kill the exponential behavior is to say that as the temperature approaches critical temperature, the correlation length of the system goes to infinity. Okay, now this is something which is kind of consistent with our initial intuition. Remember that we said that, like, you look at a spin system with nearest neighbor interaction at low energies, the spins would try to align in the same direction consistent with the nearest neighbor interaction, and no thermal energy is available to kind of dislodge or make the spins point in different directions at low temperatures. Whereas at high temperatures, the system has a behavior where it doesn't even care as to what the nearest neighbor interaction is. Every spin points in all possible directions. So these two behaviors, we wanted to ask a question: is there a way where this transition could occur from a system which is totally well behaved versus system which is totally anarchical? Okay, and Tc is a temperature at which this correlation length kind of diverges and the system reassembles into either an ordered state or a disordered state, depending upon which way you are kind of crossing the temperature, critical temperature. Okay, fine. So as I said, that the exponential factor gets killed if C goes to infinity, and therefore the correlation function or the 2-point function basically has only power law behavior. Okay, fine. So what we want to do now is to find out how would the correlation length diverge as we approach the critical point. Okay, so to do that, we'll again go back to the same set of equations that we had written down, which are these. Okay, chi is equal to all this stuff, and it is related to integral of G. Okay, and what we really want to ask is, how is the dependence, temperature dependence of the correlation length? That's all we want to know. Okay, so we are not going to look at every detail of this expression. We just want to ask how C depends on temperature. Okay, good. Okay, so what we'll do is that we'll stay in the neighborhood of T equals Tc. If you're in the neighborhood of T equals Tc, then chi shows this divergence. Okay, this is the same expression that I'm writing down. So not an equal to sign, should be minus. Number of typos are just growing, I think. Okay, so I have copied it from there to there so I can see the propagation of the error. But anyway, so what we are doing is that we are substituting chi equals T minus Tc inverse. Okay, and right hand side is the integral of G. Okay, now what we really want to know is how C behaves as a function of temperature. So we don't care about all this other stuff. Okay. So what we'll do is we'll define a new variable R. Okay. So you see this expression, right? We had an exponential minus mod x by C upon x to the d minus 1 by 2 times C to the d minus 3 by 2. Okay. This was the way G was defined. Okay. Or d minus 2 by 2, I should have kind of written it correctly. Okay. Yeah, I'll correct that. So what you and this mod x to the d minus 1 comes from d to the dx curve piece. So what you do is that you replace all these by defining r equals x, mod x by c, and write everything in terms of r integral. And if you do that, then you'll find that, just check the scaling of this thing, mod x by c would become r, so you get e to the minus r. You look at these expression and you find that c to the d minus 1 by 2 is soaked up by these two factors. So you have one c sitting around here in the numerator, because it is d minus 1 by 2 is soaked up, and it is d minus 3 by 2. So there is one c in the numerator, and d mod x can be written as c times dr. So you get a c squared piece out of all this. This integral is of no concern to us, because this integral will give you some number. Okay, whatever is that number is some factor sitting around here. All that matters to us is that c square goes as 1 over t minus tc. Okay, so we will say that c goes as 1 over t minus tc to the minus nu. Okay, and in the mean field theory, you see that the critical exponent nu would turn out to be half. Okay, because c square goes as 1 over t minus tc, so c would go as 1 over t minus tc to the half minus half. Sorry, 1 over t minus tc to the half. Okay. So this is the critical exponent that we had not seen in the last class. Okay, but now you can derive this by turning on inhomogeneous magnetic field. For example, you turn on a magnetic field which would only disturb spin at site I, okay, and nobody else. So that kind of magnetic field is inhomogeneous. Once you do that and you put it off, okay, that disturbance will generate spatial dependence in the system, and we compute correlations using those disturbances. Okay, if you do that, then you find that nu turns out to be the new critical exponent. In mean field theory, its value is half. Okay. Now, remember I told you that the 2-point function has a form like this. Okay. Now, if you imagine that if c goes to infinity, then in that case, this exponential factor is going to drop out, because that just becomes 1. Okay. Then you would expect g to be just x to the d minus 1 by 2 really, times some number. Okay. That is what you would have expected. But that's not what happens, because when you take such limits, when c going to infinity limit, then in that case, the power law behavior may develop some kind of anomalous behavior, and therefore one ends up writing a behavior of the 2-point function as 1 over r to the d minus 2 plus eta. Okay, and if you kind of look at this behavior, then you find that eta is a factor which will tell you how the g of r differs from whatever is the original behavior of the system. Okay, in the mean field approximation, of course, this number turns out to be 0. Okay, so what we have found is that in the mean field approximation, if you turn on anomalous, not anomalous, inhomogeneous external stimuli, then you can get effects which depend on space. And if you try to determine the spatial correlations of the system using those external stimuli, then you can determine that the correlation function falls off in a particular fashion, but within the mean field approximation, it does not develop any different scaling dimensions. Okay, so its anomalous dimension is just 0. Okay, whereas the rate at which the correlation length would diverge would go as t minus tc to the minus half. Okay. So now we have determined all alpha, alpha prime, beta, gamma, gamma prime, delta, similarly nu and eta within mean field theory. Okay. So now at least the way I introduced all these critical exponents, they look like they are independent quantities, and one needs to determine all these critical exponents so that we can get a good description of the system. But that is not actually true, in the sense that like not all of these critical exponents are independent. Okay, and there are some relations between these critical exponents, and we will talk about them later. These relations are actually called the scaling relations, and we will kind of spend some time deriving these scaling relations. Okay, and when we study Landau theory, then in fact we will give a kind of microscopic description of these scaling relations, which comes from the Lagrangian that we would write down in the Landau theory. Okay, so far we haven't written down any Lagrangian. In fact, we have actually written down some Hamiltonian for the spin system, but for all practical purposes within mean field theory, we haven't really used that Hamiltonian. Okay, we have kind of barring making some kind of crude approximations and reducing that Hamiltonian to individual spin experiencing some net magnetic field. Barring that, we haven't really kind of utilized any microscopic structure of the Hamiltonian of the system. Okay, so the mean field results are in that sense kind of some kind of ad hoc structure that we have kind of obtained by making some specific assumptions about how the system would behave. Okay, fine. So of course we will talk about scaling relations at a suitable time, but before we do that, let's try to kind of see, to what extent we are correct, or to what extent we have gone wrong in all our computations. Okay, so of course to do that, we'll have to look at the experimental data or data computed using, say, simulations for specific models, and compare our mean field calculations with that data. Okay, so that is what we would try to do. So there are of course certain realistic systems in which you could study this thing. For example, liquid gas phase transition or binary alloy systems and so on, in which you could actually realistically study the system, okay, and check whether that agrees with the mean field computations. Okay, so let me show you the table. So here are the main critical exponents that we will see. So remember there is a alpha and alpha prime, gamma and gamma prime. So I'm not going to look at all of them, but suppose you look at alpha. So in fact, this table I have taken from this book of Goldenfeld. Okay, so it is there in Goldenfeld's book. In fact, I can tell you the page number. In fact, I have just directly lifted from there. So it's page number 111 in Goldenfeld's book. Okay, so okay, so what we find is the following. We have found alpha, which is the specific heat exponent. We found that the exponent was 0. Specific heat within mean field theory had only discontinuity. Okay, experimental result says that the value is 0.11 to 0.1116. Okay, if you study 2D Ising model, it is actually 0. Okay, if you study 3D Ising model, it is 0.11, which is pretty close to the experimental data. Okay, beta, this is the exponent that determines temperature dependence of the magnetization. Okay, and remember it was like a parabola that we had kind of plotted, which asymptotes to plus or minus 1 value. Okay, so that beta was half within mean field theory, and experimental data shows it to be 3.16 to 3.27. Okay, now there are ranges here simply because when you are doing experiments, there are no systems which are completely pure. When you do theory, you are talking about only spin systems. You don't talk about like dislocations. You don't talk about, some other contamination. As I was saying that, like, if you are looking at 1 mole of some material and you say that like it is 99.99% pure, okay, it would still mean that out of 10 to the 23 atoms in the system, you would have like 10 to the 19 or 20 atoms of completely different stuff. Okay, and that is a reasonably large number, although in terms of fraction or in terms of percentage, it is very small. But nevertheless, those defects in the system could affect the result. Okay, so therefore, when you do experiments, you you do them with different systems, and different systems have different kinds of contaminations, and therefore they can give you a range of values. But if you don't like it this way, you could kind of look at the average value of within this range, and you could say that alpha and beta take values like that. And you can see that the 3D Ising model is again sitting within the range here. Okay, whereas 2D Ising model is 1/8, which does not agree with mean field theory at all. Okay, fine. So far mean field theory hasn't been doing very well. Okay, and if you go ahead and look at gamma, remember gamma was the exponent that we used. Okay, so let me just show you here. Gamma was the exponent that we used for determining the susceptibility. Okay, and we found that the susceptibility exponent was 1. In fact, within the mean field theory, it did not matter which way you approach TC, it was 1 anyway. Okay, experimentally, the number is 1.23 to 1.25, which is not bad actually. This number is actually better than 7/4 actually, in the sense 7/4 is further away from 1 being to 7.25 or something. Okay, of course 3D Ising model seems to fit again well with this. Okay, the next critical experiment was delta. This is the response of the magnetization to the external magnetic field, H going as m to the delta, and we had found in mean field theory the answer is 3. Experiment shows much bigger number actually. It is between 4.6 to 4.9. 2D Ising model is like way out. Okay, and the 3D Ising model gives you 4.82, which is again within the now. I should mention one thing, that 3D Ising model trying to fit many of the experimental data is not really surprising, in the sense that like what we are looking at is the materials which shows Ising universality class. Okay, so therefore Ising model results should be in the neighborhood of whatever the experiments are. The experiments are being done with a 3-dimensional system, so therefore 3D Ising model better agree with that. Okay, there is no reason why 2D Ising model should necessarily agree with the experiment, because the systems on which the experiments are done are 3-dimensional systems. Okay, so when I say 3D Ising, these are okay. Maybe I should talk about only 3D Ising. When I say 3D Ising, this is completely computer simulation. Okay, this is not experiment. Okay, whereas when I say experiment, this is actually a realistic system on which you do the experiment and check what values it takes. Okay, fine. So nu was the next exponent, which was determining how the correlation length diverged as t approached Tc, and it went as t minus Tc to the minus half. Okay, and again seems to be reasonably close to the experiment. Now, when I say reasonably close, I mean the following: that mean field theory is terribly bad approximation, in the sense, we don't care about spatial dependence. We did not even worry about the system being a lattice. We did not even worry about the fact that like there was only nearest neighbor interactions. Nothing actually. We just said that like whatever you have produces some effective field, and every spin sees the same effective field in some sense. Okay, even with that level of crude approximation, these numbers are not that bad actually. Okay, although they don't agree is also important. Okay, one shouldn't make a mistake by saying that mean field theory is giving good results. Okay, mean field theory is doing reasonable, but the results are not agreeing with the experiment. Let's be clear about that. Okay. So again, you see that the 3D Zingian experiments are pretty close. Okay. The final exponent was eta, which is the anomalous dimension of the 2-point function, and that was 0 for mean field theory, and the number is quite small experimentally also. Okay. 3D Ising fits right in the middle of this thing, and 2D Ising is way out. Okay. Because 1/4 is like 0.25. 0.25 is outside both the ranges. Okay. Now, 2D Ising model results are not numerical simulation. 2D Ising model is exactly solvable, and therefore you can see that these fractions are exact numbers in some sense. Whereas these numbers, I have not written down error bars here. There are computer simulation errors also. 2D Ising model doesn't suffer from that kind of structure simply because these are exactly soluble system. Okay, so we know these numbers pretty well, in fact. Okay, so the upshot of this exercise is that we find that whatever mean field theory computation that we have done is reasonable, although does not describe the realistic system well enough. Okay, so we will try to understand what is the thing that we need to do. We'll try to kind of generate the mean field theory results from a microscopic theory point of view again. Okay, and we will try to kind of, and after that we will set up a system which will improvise over the mean field computation. Okay, so we are kind of going to go in various steps so that, but we will also, before we kind of go to a theory which will do better than mean field theory, we'll also find out what are the situations in which mean field theory actually gives you accurate answers. Okay, so that also is something which we'll do soon. Okay, so I think I'll stop at this point, take questions.
Sir,
Yes.
Ising model only considers nearest neighbor, right?
No, you can have next nearest neighbor interaction also in the Ising model.
So like 3D Ising model, that results that you have written, you have next all the interactions.
No. These models that I have listed are all nearest neighbor interactions. That I agree.
Yeah, but the experiment still agrees with, like,
Yes.
sharply,
Yes,
sharp
yes.
enough. Yeah.
Yes, quite amazing, really. Yeah, I agree. But you can study Ising model with nearest neighbor and next nearest neighbor interaction, and you get a very interesting phase diagram, in fact. And you can see a line which separates the phases within the two-dimensional couplings plane. Okay, it's an interesting model, but of course, also difficult model to solve.
Okay.
Also, you can have systems, like, you can do more interesting stuff. Given that it's just a model, Ising model is, by name itself, it is a kind of model. So you can write down whatever you wish. So for example, you could do the following thing, that you can have a nearest neighbor ferromagnetic interaction and next nearest neighbor antiferromagnetic interaction. So to put it a little kind of quantitatively, you say Jij, Si, Sj, where Ij are nearest neighbors, that J is positive. Okay, but Jij, Si, Sj, when Ij are next nearest neighbor, that J is negative. Okay, this kind of model also could be studied. Okay, and these kind of systems are actually occur in nature, and one can study the structure of that even experimentally. Okay, but that is of course next level of complication in the system, because you have two couplings in the system. Both of them are kind of important in determining the kind of phase structure of the system. And then if one of the coupling is 0, you see this kind of transition that we have studied. If the other coupling is 0, then you kind of see some different kind of phase transition. And then you see a line of line which separates one phase from the other phase in a two-dimensional system. Okay, it's a I don't know if I can find it somewhere. I can kind of point you to kind of that reference. Maybe some of the books have it actually. Any other question?